No dobrze, drodzy Państwo, witam serdecznie. Dobry wieczór Państwu. Nazywam się Krzysztof Bogalecki i będę miał przyjemność przeprowadzić Państwa przez to dzisiejsze spotkanie, z czego bardzo rzecz jasna się cieszę. Witam Państwa szczególnie serdecznie na debacie naukowej, podczas której zastanowimy się, czy inteligentny projekt w przyrodzie jest iluzją, czy może rzeczywistością. Gościmy dzisiaj 4 wybitnych uczonych, drodzy Państwo, a wśród nich profesor Malgorzatę Moczydłowską-Vidal. Witamy serdecznie, dzień dobry, prosimy o brawa. Profesora Michaela Rusa, witamy serdecznie. Profesora J Behego i doktora Richarda Sternberga. W imieniu organizatora Fundacji Arche serdecznie witamy i dziękujemy za Państwa obecność także na tym wydarzeniu i brawa dla Państwa również przewidziane. Bardzo proszę. A wydarzenie, drodzy Państwo, jest niezwykłe, bowiem skupia się na jednym z bardziej intrygujących tematów współczesnej nauki. Czy świat przyrody zawiera struktury, co do których zasadnie możemy powiedzieć, że są dziełem projektu, czy też może ten projekt jest tylko iluzją? O przypadkowości świata przyrody ożywionej przekonany był Karol Darwin, a jego pogląd jest wciąż powszechny. Znany ewolucjonista Richard Dawkins napisał w książce Ślepy zegarmistrz słynne zdanie, że biologia zajmuje się obiektami złożonymi, tworzącymi wrażenie celowego zamysłu. Natomiast zwolennicy ujęcia przeciwnego, mam tu na myśli zwolenników teorii inteligentnego projektu, są przekonani, że projekt w przyrodzie nie jest wrażeniem, nie jest iluzją, lecz jest rzeczywistością. Obie strony sporu argumentują, że ich pogląd ma właściwe uzasadnienie na gruncie nauki. Dzisiaj mamy szczególną okazję wysłuchać argumentów obu stron w duchu naukowych i filozoficznych dociekań. Po prezentacji każdego z prelegentów czeka nas krótka przerwa, po której rozpoczniemy panel dyskusyjny, podczas którego obie strony debaty będą mogły uzasadnić swoje poglądy w ogniu pytań adwersarzy. W ostatniej części spotkania będzie czas na pytanie Państwa, czyli pytania publiczności. Czy naszym prelegentom uda się przekonać pozostałych uczestników i słuchaczy do zweryfikowania chociażby części poglądów, które wyznawał przed debatą? O tym przekonamy się niedługo. Wspomnę też, że przez cały czas trwania wydarzenia można odwiedzić stoisko Fundacji Arche, które już pewnie gros Państwa odwiedziło dzisiaj, gdzie zakupią Państwo książki po naprawdę okazyjnej cenie. Przed rozpoczęciem poproszę jeszcze Państwa o upewnienie się, że wyciszyliście swoje telefony komórkowe. A teraz przedstawię Państwu pierwszego prelegenta. Profesor Behe jest amerykańskim biochemikiem. Tytuł doktora zdobył w 1978 roku na Uniwersytecie Pensylwanii. Jego praca doktorska dotyczyła anemii sierpowatej. W latach 1978-1982 odbył staż podoktorski w Narodowym Instytucie Zdrowia, gdzie zajmował się strukturą DNA. W latach 1982-1985 był adiunktem na Wydziale Chemii w Queen's College w Nowym Jorku. W 1985 roku przeniósł się do Leeds University, gdzie do dziś wykłada biochemię. Profesor Behe jest autorem ponad 40 specjalistycznych artykułów. Napisał także kilka książek, z których najbardziej znana jest Czarna skrzynka Darwina. Biochemiczne wyzwanie dla ewolucjonizmu. W swoich pracach profesor rozwinął koncepcję nieredukowalnej złożoności. Zapraszam zatem na wystąpienie pana profesora.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. In my short opening presentation, I'm going to make 3 points. The first point is that modern science has discovered that the foundation of life, the cellular and molecular foundation of life, is run by machines. Literally, machines made of molecules. The second point is that that machinery resists explanation by Darwinian evolution because the machinery is made of multiple parts. And a gradual theory such as Darwin presented is difficult to reconcile with a multi-part system. The third point is that the same machinery points strongly to intelligent design, because just as machinery in our everyday world requires foresight to put it together, when we find that in biology as well, it points strongly to design there too. So let me start by looking at the man who's responsible for much of this debate. Charles Darwin, of course, was born in the year 1809, which was over 200 years ago. And he had a great career as a naturalist. And he traveled the world and saw that there were many different organisms, and he wondered why many of them should vary. And that led him to propose his theory of evolution by random variation and natural selection. But scientists of Darwin's era did not know why organisms varied, and they didn't know how organisms could pass on traits to future generations. Even though inheritance and reproduction was a foundation of Darwin's theory, he and all other scientists of his era were ignorant of the causes of it. As a matter of fact, cellular life looked like it was simple back in the day. Here's a drawing of some material that some supporters of Darwin thought represented cellular life, which was dredged up from the sea floor. And they thought that it was so simple, they called it protoplasm, that sea mud might spontaneously generate life like that. Well, of course, now we know that cells are extremely complex organisms, but it wasn't until after Darwin's theory was proposed, and pretty much after the neo-Darwinian theory was also developed in the 1930s through the 1950s, that the molecular foundation of life was elucidated. For example, in the early 1950s, up in the top left, shows Watson and Crick, who of course discovered the double helical structure of DNA, the information carrier of life. And in the middle, next to Watson and Crick, is a man named John Kendrew, who first elucidated the structure of a protein called myoglobin. And on the right side, it was only in the 1960s that the genetic code was discovered and elucidated. And on the bottom 3 panels, they represent different techniques that modern science has used to investigate the foundation of life. On the left is cloning, the ability to clone small pieces of DNA, which allows science to investigate its properties in detail. In the middle is a technique called polymerase chain reaction, which also allowed details to be investigated and changes to be made in life to see what would result from changes in DNA. And most especially on the right-hand side, in the year 2000 or thereabouts, improvements in sequencing of DNA allowed the genomes, the entire DNA complement of organisms, to be relatively easily elucidated. And what science has learned can be illustrated in the next slide, which is going to show a short video And in the first part here, we see bacteria just swimming around. They look like simple little things. This is what the microscopes of Darwin's day might have shown. But here's higher resolution where you're starting to see that, well, those bacteria have some shape to them. I don't know if you can see, but at the top of this bacterium here, there's a little screw that's turning around at the end of it. And that is what is allowing this bacterium to swim through the liquid. And with further experiments, scientists were able to show that this was powered by an outboard motor, literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. It's called the bacterial flagellum. And if you look at it, it looks like some sort of space-age device. That long tail there is the propeller itself. When it's swung around, it pushes against liquid, which pushes the bacterium forward. It's attached to the drive shaft, which is the yellow cylinder in the middle, by an orange portion there, which is called a universal joint. And the drive shaft is turned by the motor, which uses a flow of acid from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell to turn it, much as water flowing over a dam can turn a turbine engine to generate motion there. And let me just say that this drawing, although it looks complex, is just a cartoon of the machine, and that has many, many features that we do not have time to look through this evening. Nonetheless, this is an illustration that the foundation of life is run by machines. And journal, an issue of the journal Cell, which was published about 20 years ago, makes this point clearly. It was a special issue on macromolecular machines. And if you can read the title of the articles in this table of contents here, the first one is The Cell as a Collection of Protein Machines, Polymerases and Replosome, Machines within Machines, Mechanical Devices of the Spliceosome, Motors, Clocks, Springs, and Things. And this has only become more intense as science has advanced and looked more and more closely in the cell. This is a molecular model of a protein called ATP synthase, which is literally a turbine engine which uses a flow of acid to synthesize the energy packets of the cell called adenosine triphosphate. And I think you can see the many different parts of it, the rotary engine on the bottom and on the top, and the portions that hold it together and so on. And again, it's much more complicated than even this makes it seem. Now, an interesting part about machines is that machines, by definition almost, except for the simplest of machines, require multiple parts to work. And here's an example from our everyday experience, a simple mousetrap. As you can see, mousetraps have a number of different parts. They have a spring and a platform and metal parts that act as the hammer to strike a mouse and so on. And you cannot put these things, or certainly not in any straightforward fashion, you cannot put these things together gradually in a step-by-step manner as Darwin had proposed. What's more, when we see such things, when we see parts that are arranged to perform a function, such as in a mousetrap or in a flagellum, that is the hallmark of purposeful, intelligent design. And in fact, that's widely recognized by many folks. For example, Richard Dawkins has written that the study of biology, that materials in biology overwhelmingly appear as if they were purposely designed. Of course, he does not think they were. He thinks that Darwinian processes might have produced them, but he does not know how, and he agrees that they appear to be designed. And in commenting on the idea of intelligent design, a man named Franklin Harold, in a book published a couple decades ago, wrote the following. He said that we must reject, as a matter of principle, the proposal of intelligent design. But, he adds, we must admit that we do not know how biochemical systems have arisen. And I think that's a good indication that a conclusion of intelligent design is compelling because, as Dawkins admits, everything appears strongly to be designed, and that the major reason that that conclusion is resisted by mainstream science is that it's philosophically unacceptable. So my conclusion is that, in fact, intelligent design, from what we have discovered in life, is rationally compelling. And a further conclusion is that I think it is unjust. I think it is unjust for mainstream science to let the public think that they are able to explain the foundation of life when they cannot. Thank you very much.
Bardzo dziękujemy panu profesorowi także za świetną organizację czasu swojego wystąpienia. Zapraszam teraz do wystąpienia kolejnego prelegenta. Dr Richard Sternberg jest amerykańskim biologiem i ewolucyjnym specjalizującym się w badaniach genów, homologii morfologicznych i informacji zawartej w genomie. Posiada doktorat z biologii molekularnej uzyskany na Florida International University, a także doktorat w dziedzinie teorii systemów biologii teoretycznej, który obronił na Binghamton University. W latach 1999-2001 odbył staże podoktorskie na Wydziale Zoologii Bezkręgowców Narodowego Muzeum Historii Naturalnej w Narodowym Instytucie Zdrowia. W latach 2001-2007 pracował jako asystent naukowy w Narodowym Muzeum Historii Naturalnej. Obecnie pracuje w Biologic Institute należącym do Discovery Institute. W latach 2001-2004 był także redaktorem naczelnym Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington oraz współredaktorem International Journal of General Systems. Przed Państwem, drodzy Państwo, dr Richard Sternberg. Bardzo proszę.
All right, thank you for having me. Thank you. I want to start out by saying how I define intelligent design. First of all, I do not rely on any Abrahamic texts. I'm a Platonist, so you want my version of ID, all you have to do is crack open the Timaeus. So I start out from Plato, all right? Number one. Number two, I don't question common descent. I accept the geological record. So I don't have an issue with speciation or anything like that. What I do think, though, is that we can infer design. And again, I'm going back to a Platonic conception of it, logically and mathematically. What led me to this position was that in the 1980s, I studied the functionality of so-called junk or selfish DNA. And I found many of the arguments Richard Dawkins had presented in 1976, the notion of the selfish gene. In 1980, the explanation for why, say, 98% of our DNA and majority of DNA in plants and animals, protozoans, etc., appears to be quote-unquote non-coding. For me, this was it was designated as being just junk DNA. It was intellectually vacuous, quote-unquote, as W4 Doolittle put it, to search for function. So this goaded me to search for function. I came to the conclusion, as others had, like James Shapiro, and that so many of the sequences that we had written off as being just non-functional. Actually were replete with functionality, and that when you looked at it from again, a logical and mathematical perspective, the layers of specifications, while they definitely have a material basis, nevertheless, I do not believe can be explained by random mutation, any kind of neutral mechanism, and coupled with natural selection. And since the clock is ticking here, and time is always, for me, the enemy, I'll move forward. What happened when the human genome and mouse genome and a number of other genomes had been sequenced in the early 2000s, the idea was that we'd be able to read the DNA letters, 4 of them, and we'd be able to, as it was sold to Congress, quote unquote, compute an organism, all right? So you could read the DNA and you could say, well, this person's predisposed to this disease, this person's going to, have this problem. And so a program was started, it was an international consortium called ENCODE. And what they found is that even though roughly 1.5% of our DNA codes for proteins, the vast majority of DNA at some point during our development, this would be true for a mouse and a fruit fly, is transcribed into RNA, and then those RNAs are used for various purposes. Well, this raised a very interesting question. And the question is, what is a gene? Now, it would seem, well, we obviously know what a gene is. It's a stretch of DNA, and it codes for protein, et cetera. But when the term gene was defined, which was 1909 by Wilhelm Johansen, the Danish botanist, he said the gene is a placeholder. He was not a materialist, by the way. He was an Aristotelian. And his arguments, if you read very carefully, that large, thick book in German, he's like, well, the gene is a placeholder. And this idea, even Thomas Hunt Morgan, who became famous, he made the fruit fly famous in genetics, up until the time he died, he wasn't sure exactly what this thing called a gene is. Barbara McClintock, who discovered jumping genes, she said the gene is a philosophical notion. So in 2007, this became an issue. What is it? And for me, this raised a very significant question, because I was thinking, well, I think junk DNA, the notion of it, is false, and on empirical grounds. And by the same token, how can you have a theory based on an entity that you cannot define? How can you discuss the evolution of something that is kind of this amorphous notion? And so this came to the fore, and it's still a problem. And there have been a number of attempts. And so in 2012, a very interesting definition was proposed that received a lot of pushback from the many evolutionary biologists, such as Dan Grauer. And I'll just give you a line here. It says, genes represent a higher order framework around which individual transcripts or RNAs, the readouts, coalesce, creating a polyfunctional entity that assumes different forms under different cellular states. This meant that all of a sudden we're talking about something that's no longer this well-defined stretch of letters. We're talking about something that's polyfunctional and that's constantly changing in real time. And immediately this was picked up on by a number of advocates of junk DNA. And what they suggested was that the whole ENCODE project simply be shut down until, in other words, molecular biologists were properly trained in population genetics and evolutionary biology. They should not be exploring all of these so-called dark regions of the genome. They need to get their mind straight, and then you can go and you can start exploring things. I found that very interesting. And so, in my opinion, in order for a gene, to be a higher order polyfunctional entity that takes on different forms at different times, it has to be more than an invariant particle. And as I and others have, some co-authors of mine, who are not at all ID proponents, but we wrote articles about this, is that we're in a position in biology similar to where physics was beginning around the 1860s, 1870s, up until the 1920s and 1930s, when you had a transition from the atom as being this little ball until you get to something that's far more amorphous. Then quantum mechanics comes along and we say, well, it doesn't invalidate classical mechanics, but at the same time, you have to step out of it. I think a very similar situation is going on in terms of what genes are, and I think evolutionary biology has to catch up with that. And I'm going to skip over all of this stuff because you see, too many slides, too little time, and I'm just going to jump right to the end, and I apologize for all of this. But the point is, when we try to make sense of it, we come up with new terms, and one of these terms is a so-called epigenome. And this is the idea, you have genome and DNA, but then you have something epi to it, something to the side of or above, and so on and so forth. But Paul Davies, the physicist, he broached this topic in 2012, and what he said was very telling. He said, we will look in vain for any physical object in the cell that we can call the epigenome. It lacks a physical headquarters. It is a virtual object. And if you know anything about computational architecture, like an operating system, for example, you're at the highest level of software abstraction. You can't take any one of your computers or cell phones, crack it open, break it, and say, I got the operating system, I've dropped it into a test tube, and I'm going to look at it under the microscope. It relies on physics, it relies on things like that, but it's not something that is a physical entity as such. And if this is a case, if DNA of any particular organism at any particular time is indeed something that has above it layers of information, and these layers of information are these higher order polyfunctional software abstractions, then I think we have a concept that takes us far beyond a theory that we call neo-Darwinism that was crafted in the 19-teens and the 1920s, and my time is up, and that's my point. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo panu doktorowi za tę prelekcję. Zapraszam teraz profesor Malgorzatę Moczydłowską-Vidal, która będzie argumentowała na rzecz tezy, że inteligentny projekt w przyrodzie to iluzja. Pani profesor jest szwedzkim paleobiologiem polskiego pochodzenia i profesorem mikropaleontologii na Uniwersytecie w Uppsali. Ukończyła studia na Uniwersytecie Warszawskim, po których uzyskała tytuł magistra, następnie otrzymała stopień doktora na Lunds Universitet oraz stopień doktora habilitowanego i tytuł profesora na Uppsala Universitet. W latach 1986-1987 prowadziła badania w Center for the Study of Evolution and the Origin of Life. Prowadziła także badania w ramach licznych programów stypendialnych na zagranicznych uczelniach. Od 1991 roku dzieliła czas na badania, promocję stopni naukowych oraz na wykłady na Uppsala Universitet. Współpraca z licznymi naukowcami w interdyscyplinarnych programach badawczych skierowała uwagę profesor Moczydłowskiej-Vidal na zagadnienia związane z ewolucją środowiska, a szczególnie na środowiskowe uwarunkowania biologiczno-geochemiczne. Jest autorką ponad 100 artykułów w naukowych, recenzowanych czasopismach i 4 monografii. Pani profesor, bardzo proszę.
Dziękuję. Darwin was the first person who formulated, even he used the information from his predecessors about the theory of evolution. However, it was 164 years ago, and of course, during this time, his theory was criticized, adjusted, revised, and of course, it is changed very much from the original form because of the simple fact that any theory is evolving as well with the new information and interpretation. And of course, this was mostly due to research in molecular biology, evolutionary biology, and genetic mostly. However, what stands and is undeniable is the fact that process of evolution was going on and affected the past life and the present life. But having what he formulated in his book, seminal work on origin of the species, those first 4 lines about the successive appearance of new taxa, the different rates of exchange, species which disappear, became extinct, never appear again, and the other formulated thesis in his work stands, and they are now accepted as laws of biology because they were confirmed by studies as well as genetics. However, what is as well very important that Darwin set his theory as law-bound theory. It means laws of physics, chemistry, biology constrain the processes in evolution affecting the organisms. And those are what was as well very interesting, that in the last sentence of his book, he really acknowledged the presence of creator. So he did not, in fact, deny the presence of God. Anyway, with the new studies and new information, we know now that the basic elements of life, hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, are the most dominant elements in all organisms. We know as well that basic chemistry predicts that from very simple molecules like hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, methane, and water, and with the energy which is available in environments like sun energy or ultraviolet radiation, life arose from reactions between matter and energy. And this climb was very well documented by numerous experiments by the authors mentioned here, and those authors produced in the laboratories both bases of nucleic acids, but as well amino acids. It means the basic molecules in life and in RNA and DNA. So they convincingly documented that those molecules could form totally abiotically. And this is the common knowledge now, that all living organisms contain nucleic acids, but as well proteins containing amino acids. And what is very important is what is called the chirality, is that those molecules, both which are synthesized in living organisms, synthesize only one enantiomer. It means left-handed amino acids and right-handed sugars in nucleic acid. And this is the evidence of life. And this is a feature which is used now for in the probes sent to outer space to look by spectroscopy to recognize the chiral molecules. Anyway, jumping through the very well-known system of DNA, RNA, and stringing proteins, it was inferred that the RNA world was at the first because molecules of RNA can be formed by autopoiesis, it means self-assembly, and they reproduce. So when we jump now to the entire world shown here in this diagram, which is not any longer tree of life, but bush of life or star of life, because all the groups of organisms which we know now have their place, and the length of these lines show the relatedness of the organisms, and this bush of life is based on the small subunit of mitochondrial RNA, so this is based on the genetics. The numbers which are shown here are as well showing that we recognize from the fossil record that bacteria definitely existed by 3.87 gigayears back in time, that eukaryotic organisms perhaps 3.2 or 2.1 gigayears back in time. And this is as well my contribution, because from the age of 1.8 gigayears, we have evidence documented by fossils and geo and biochemical studies, the algae, photosynthesizing organisms. When we look at this diagram, mammals appeared around 630 million years ago, so they are very young in global scale organisms, and our own genus, Homo, has only perhaps 200,000 years. So from this perspective, and this branching of the life, prokaryotic and eukaryotic, it is very clear that there is no any direction in the evolution, there is no any specific upgrading or directional evolution, because all the organisms, prokaryotic, eukaryotic, develop very much and as a matter of fact, our own species is just one species. It is very specific because we have our mind, intelligence, we have self-awareness, and of course we study the world around us. But in the global scale, we are not very special. Anyway, coming back to the major events, how the universe developed, it is now accepted by various disciplines of sciences that 14.6 gigayears back in time, in the event of Big Bang, the matter and energy began to extend, and it is extending up today. And of course, through the time, planets were formed, and including our own rocky planets, on which we know the chemistry of life. So the habitable conditions on the planet Earth at some time, perhaps 4 gigayears back in time, were already suitable for the abiotic chemistry leading to biotic origin of life. And we know as well that this sequence of appearing of taxa is very well established by studying different kinds of fossils, but as well biochemical structures, biomarkers, which are the chemical molecules which are diagnostic for different group of organisms, but as well by carbon fractionation, which in fact is the primary mechanism of selecting isotopes of carbon into the living organisms. So coming back to what Darwin was saying about mutations and selection, selection definitely exists already in very early time. I will perhaps skip now speaking about the succession of the fossils, because probably this would be very boring, but we have now very different methods of studying, not only looking at the shape and morphology of fossils, but very different geo and biochemical methods and very sophisticated methods in which, looking at these microfossils, which is shown here, we can even detect what is the biochemical composition of the cell wall, and in this case, it is alganan, and this is the biopolymer, which is only synthesized by photosynthesizing algae. So, using different methods of studies, we can recognize as well biological affinity of fossils. Some of the microfossils are shown here. Those are prokaryotes, which were the early fossils. But there are as well eukaryotic single-cell biota, and this is one of the taxa which I described from Poland. And what Michael called that small really is beautiful. Those microfossils are beautiful, and they contain alganan, so we know they are algae. Now coming to metazoans. This is recently published record of metazoans from around 630 million years ago. And those fossils now are in the scale of centimeters. They are biomineralized. It means they have external skeleton. And those are 90 million years earlier than the so-called Cambrian explosion, which for some time was misinterpreted as sudden appearance of metazoans and sign of intelligent design. Not at all. We have even longer records. Now, coming to the timing, using isotopic methods, of course, we have very elegant now and detailed recognition of the time and the appearance of the fossils. And all those groups or kingdoms of organisms which were very well known to Darwin, but he did not know, but predicted correctly the Precambrian fossils, and now we know very many. So his prediction appeared correct. Of course, since his theory, we have very different and very many mechanisms, not only mutation and selection, and this mostly derives from the studies of genetics, but we have as well confirmation that selection existed and exists at the level of molecules, particles, organisms, and as well genes. So coming back to the most recent examples, we have confirmation that both mutations and selections are discovered and proved, and of course the random and constrained by the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, mutations and selection exist and play a role in the evolution, and evolution has no evidence for design. And of course, some people may see evolution in a very different way. This is the vision of the Swedish critic or satiric. But if we look for the scientific evidence, the life look like that. Thank you.
Serdecznie dziękujemy, pani profesor. Zapraszam teraz naszego czwartego prelegenta. Profesor Michael Ruse jest amerykańskim filozofem specjalizującym się w filozofii biologii, historii nauki, zwłaszcza ewolucjonizmu. Po ukończeniu studiów na Uniwersytecie Bristolskim zdobył tytuł licencjata filozofii i matematyki, a tytuł magistra filozofii na Uniwersytecie McMastera. Następnie wrócił na Uniwersytet Bristolski, gdzie uzyskał stopień doktora. W latach 1974-2000 pracował na stanowisku profesora zwyczajnego filozofii na Uniwersytecie w Guelph. Był członkiem Royal Society of Canada, amerykańskiego Towarzystwa na Rzecz Rozwoju. Uczony jest autorem licznych publikacji. Założył także czasopismo Biology and Philosophy. Był także biegłym powołanym przez American Civil Liberties Union w czasie rozprawy w Arkansas. W 1981 roku, podczas której unieważniono prawo dotyczące nauczania teorii stworzenia. Bardzo proszę.
Thank you. You'll probably tell immediately from my accent that I was born in England. When I was 22, I went to Canada, and I spent most of my life there. As you imagine, this was the early 1960s when I went. There were a great many of your fellow countrymen, Polish people, either themselves or the children of Polish people who are my colleagues, and even more, my students. I should say also a great many Ukrainians. So for me, coming here and talking to you is not just a pleasure. I want to say it's a privilege, because I hold you and your country in very, very high regard. Now, this is John Henry Newman. He was an Englishman. He started off as a Protestant, but then halfway through his life, he became a Roman Catholic and ended up as a cardinal. And Newman was a great theologian. And I'm going to quote, I'm showing you, this was a letter that he wrote to somebody in about 1870. In other words, 10 years after Darwin published The Origin of Species. And what he says is, I believe in design because I believe in God. I do not believe in God because I believe in design. Now, I'm not a Christian, but I want to say I'm guided by what Newman said. I don't think it's silly to be a Christian. I don't think it's wrong to be a Christian. But it's not for me. But I think if you are a Christian, I think it's a terrible mistake to do as our two first speakers were doing, and trying to, as it were, work back from the world to God. Because the trouble is, apart from anything else, there's the problem of evil and things not going right. If you start with God, and he created, then you, of course, you can say that this, for instance, is designed. Of course you can. And then, of course, then you have to go on and talk about genes which don't work, sickle cell anemia, and that sort of thing. And so what you have to do is, in some sense, what you have to do then, in some sense, is, am I working okay? Yeah? Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. So what you have to do then, in some sense, is work from God, and you must explain the difficulties. If you work from the world, as it were, if you work from the hand, then you must also work from sickle cell anemia. And the trouble is, then, what kind of God are you going to be able to infer? And if you're honest, you might say, well, this God does some good things, but this God also does things that are really very helpful, and which, oh, you're going to come and put me right? I'm always doing things wrong, aren't I? My life is always being told off by women that I've got to do things better. Okay, are we working now? Yeah? Okay. So, as I say, this is where I want to start. I'm not here to say there's no God or anything like that. I'm not here to say there's no evidence of design. But I am here to say the right way to go at it is to start with God, whom you presumably believe in on faith and these sorts of things, and then you work to the world. You do not start with the world and work back to God, because if you do, then the kind of God you're going to produce, I think, is not one that you want to worship. Now, the intelligent design people obviously want to say the world is so designed in ways that it couldn't be done by evolution, because you can't get all the steps. Now, I'm showing you a bridge, a keystone, what we call a keystone bridge. And as you know, if you started to build it just as it is, and started with the rocks on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, by the time you got towards the middle, everything would keep falling down, and you just simply couldn't do it. But we know what happened. You build yourself an embankment, and then you put stones on top of it and get them to push against each other, and then you can take the embankment out, which of course is precisely what you do here. Now, I want to say that the intelligent design people, the flagellum, for instance, say, oh no, it couldn't possibly be, as it were, a one-shot thing because it just wouldn't work, and if you took the parts out, it wouldn't work, and all of those sorts of things. I agree. But the point is, as a great scientist said, it's a bricolage. You have things which are working, they get together and they work in other ways, and then they realize, oh, I'm giving them souls, but then, as it were, they realize that they don't need the original thing, and in fact, it costs energy and everything like that. So those go. So yes, bacterial flagellum could not just be put together like that. But no Darwinian thinks that's so. And more than that, Darwinians are worried because when this happened, then presumably for a long time, these things are just hanging around waiting to be used. And of course, we know that there's all sorts of mutation and selections, so it really wouldn't work very well that way either. So what I want to say, and more than this, I want to say, I think the intelligent design people are being untrue to Christianity. In other words, I think that they have a wrong sense of Christianity. This is from a very high Anglican, Church of England, at the end of the 19th century, called Aubrey Moore. And what he says is, either God is everywhere, present in nature, or he is nowhere. He cannot be here and not there. He cannot delegate his power to demigods called second causes. In nature, everything must be his work or nothing. We must frankly return to the Christian view of divine agency, the immanence of divine power from end to end, the belief in a God in whom not only we, but all things have their being, or we must banish him altogether. And I think the problem with intelligent design is you have God coming along, boom, boom, boom. And then what God does then is he goes to the bar and has a few drinks, and the world keeps going on because he's done it all. I think the proper Christian position is to say God is here always, and God is working, as it were, with us always. And the fact that he does it through unbroken law, as the evolutionist, the Darwinian says, that's just fine. By saying natural selection is at work, you're not saying God's put his feet up and having a few gin and tonics with the angels. He's just not doing that. So I think intelligent design theory is not only bad science, I think it's bad theology. Now, is there any other way that do you have to be a Christian to hold that sort of position? No. As I say, I'm not a Christian, but I very much, if you like, are mystical because I grew up as a Quaker, and Quakers are very much this sort of way. I think the world is, as the bottom thing, is the world is not only queerer than we can suppose, but queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. I think there's all sorts of things like quantum entanglement, even the body-mind problem. How on earth do molecules think? I don't know. So, as I say, I think this is a mystery world, a wonderful world. Now, you may say, oh yes, but I've got one step further. I've got faith. I have, as it were, contact with God. Well, that's your position. It's not mine. But I want to show you I can have my position consistently. And more importantly, up at the top, I can hold the same religious beliefs or the same beliefs about morality as you can. This is John Stuart Mill. When people who are fairly fortunate in their material circumstances don't find sufficient enjoyment to make life valuable for them, this is usually because they care for nobody but themselves. And you think, we've all been in groups, and there's one person who said, no, I can't, I'm so busy, no. And the other person says, oh, you, where's the textbook? Where do I go to help? And you know which is the happy person. So, as you say, intelligent design theory, for me, is God coming along, boom, boom, boom. I want a God, or I want you to have a God who's there all the time. I want one who is, as I say, caring about us all of the time. And I think, I go back to the original argument from design, this is Archdeacon Paley, and I want to say, no, it's good work, good idea, but it doesn't work. It's bad science, but also it's bad theology. So, intelligent design theory, not needed, not Christian. And I end with Walt Disney, because I come from Florida. That's all, folks. That's it. Thank you.
Szanowni Państwo, jesteśmy gotowi, aby rozpocząć drugą, ekscytującą część wydarzenia. Będzie ona polegała na wzajemnym zadawaniu pytań przez każdą ze stron. Prelegenci mogą zadawać pytania i odpowiadać jako drużyna lub oddzielnie. Pytania mogą być skierowane do konkretnego prelegenta lub całej strony i mogą, ale nie muszą, dotyczyć dzisiejszej prezentacji. Ważne, aby skupiały się na naukowych i filozoficznych zagadnieniach głównego tematu. I ustalamy, drodzy Państwo, taką zasadę. Minuta na zadanie pytanie i, drodzy Państwo, uwaga, 3 minuty na udzielenie odpowiedzi. Proszę, abyśmy się, drodzy Państwo, tego trzymali. Jakby mamy pewne ramy czasowe, które nas obligują, zobowiązują i chcemy też je absolutnie tutaj wypełnić. I ewentualną oczywiście replikę, również 3 minuty Państwu daję czasu. Ja tego czasu będę starał się pilnować, aczkolwiek nie będę też w połowie zdania Państwu wchodził oczywiście w słowo. A następnie kolejne pytanie od drugiej strony. Jeżeli po drodze zgubimy nieco ten wątek, będę tutaj, drodzy Państwo, interweniował. Przypominam, że na sam koniec będzie możliwość zadawania pytań przez szanownych zebranych tutaj Państwa. Dlatego już teraz zachęcam do przygotowywania sobie wcześniej jasno sformułowanych pytań, tudzież zagadnień. Rozpoczną profesor Vidal i profesor Ruse poprzez zadanie pytania profesorowi Behemu oraz Sternbergowi. Możemy zacząć. Proszę zatem o pierwsze pytanie.
Well, if I may ask to Michael, please. You express your opinion that the intelligent design is rationally compelling. I would like to recall you that your example of bacterial flagellum mechanism was criticized 20 years ago and after, and it was dismissed as any indication or any design. Similar processes in the flagella are appearing due to the flow, charges, and so on, so it needn't to be designed. So I question if it is really rationally compelling project.
Well, okay. Let me just say that when I first wrote Darwin's Black Box, I did a thorough literature search for papers that might have proposed detailed testable models for how such a machine might have evolved in a Darwinian step-by-step fashion. And there were a grand total of 0 such articles. After my book came out, some persons looked to see, well, are there any similar proteins or any similar machines in the cell? And some people did find similar machines, or similar proteins that at least had some homology to them. But having something that has a bit of homology to a machine is not an explanation for how such a thing arose. You could say that, well, you know, this clock has a spring in it, and the mousetrap has a spring in it. So what? Did the mousetrap arise from the spring, or vice versa? And the answer is, well, if it did, if you're going to claim it did, you have to do a whole lot more work to explain such a thing than just to point out some similarities. And let me say that 4 years ago, I published another book called Darwin Devolves, in which I developed the argument further. And I again did a literature survey for who might have published in the science literature, not in on blog posts or even in book chapters where people don't actually have a strong peer review. And their answer is that there are still 0 articles explaining trying to explain how the bacterial flagellum could have arisen in a Darwinian process. Let me further say that there is a very well-known evolution experiment by a microbiologist named Richard Lenski at Michigan State University, in which he grew bacteria for a long time to see how they would evolve in his laboratory. And over time, he saw a number of beneficial mutations that came along. And one of the first beneficial mutations was one that affected the flagellum. And what it did was shut down the flagellum. That was one of the first mutations to come along. There was no indication that it was on the way to build any particular molecular machine. But it did quickly destroy that molecular machine. I think it's rationally compelling. First of all, there are no explanations, despite some huffing and puffing in the literature. And number two, again, the evidence for design is when we see a purposeful arrangement of parts, such as in a mousetrap or any place where you walk along and things are arranged, in a flower garden at Mount Rushmore and other such things. And of course, we see a very purposeful arrangement of parts in the bacterial flagellum. And so, the purposeful arrangement of parts is a strong indicator of design, and we have no other explanation, Darwinian pretensions notwithstanding.
Should I answer? Well, thank you. And I believe that reference to that Darwinian theory does not explain. Oh, it is old argument because there are many things after Darwin developed that explain. And one of the explanations why the flagellum is not any special design, it was discussed by Miller. Do you agree with his arguments or not? He tried to convey the message that it is nothing special. Another point, why to treat the cell or RNA as machinery? They are just regular processes between the molecules. You use the example of proteins, and nothing special is happening. Another point, what you just saying, what is the purpose of this design?
Okay, very, very good questions. Thank you very much. Let me answer the second question first. Why do I call these things machines? If you go to PubMed, the database for biochemical and molecular biological literature and much else too, and you type in the words molecular machine, you'll get tens of thousands of hits. This is not my coinage, the molecular machine. In the year 1998, in that special issue of Cell that I showed as a slide, there was an introduction written by a man named Bruce Alberts, who was at that time the president of the United States National Academy of Sciences. And he said, well, this is a special issue on machines. Why do we call these things machines? Because, he said, like machines in our everyday life, they use the force in a directed manner to do specific tasks. That's the definition of a machine. So unless you're going to use some vitalistic notion that you can't make machines out of proteins, because they are different, then they fit the standard dictionary definition of machine. And when we are not discussing things in this context of controversy, all molecular biologists, all biochemists use the term molecular machine. Let me just refer to the first one, refer to an article by a man named Kenneth Miller, who wrote against my argument for the flagellum. And he did do that, but one thing you have to know is that he didn't do any experiments. He just wrote kind of a story where he thought that he might imagine a pathway whereby a flagellum might result. Number two, it was written in the chapter of a book, not in published papers. Number three, the argument was about 2 pages long for an enormously complicated machine that would take people years to try to figure out how such a thing could evolve. Number four is Miller's research interest is not in flagella. Pretty much it's in debating ID proponents. That's his expertise. And let me reiterate that if you look in the science literature, if you look in Nature, if you look in the journal Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and more, and you ask yourself, who has published an experimental study or a detailed theoretical study of how such a machine could have evolved? The answer, again, is nobody. And that's over 25 years since my book came out, even though most mainstream scientists hate this idea, and they would be delighted to show that it was wrong. And I think that just shows the weakness of Darwinism and the strength of intelligent design.
Thank you. And if I may ask Richard, functionality of molecules. This was debated as well for a long time ago by Lima de Faria, geneticist, and he called it that form and function of molecules arised by or appeared by the autoevolution led by laws, nothing else. How would you answer or explain more or give the argument that functionality of molecules is due to the intelligent design?
Well, I will step back to the position I mentioned earlier, and that is, first of all, let me say I'm a fan. I remember reading works of Lima de Faria on his chromosome field hypothesis. I'm having a minor issue here. And so I just want to say, yes, I am very familiar with his work. I have a number of his books on autoevolution. I don't have a problem with it, and it's for this reason. Again, I'm going to go back 2,500 years ago, and that is, again, with Timaeus. You have an approach, Plato's approaching it via Timaeus, and he starts out with a top-down vertical approach, the demiurge and all that, but then what does he switch to? He acknowledges that there's chaos, there's determinism, everything is in flux. And to explain it, he resorts to what? The Platonic solids. He presents a geometrical explanation for how the solids can come together, and lays the groundwork for Euclid, who comes some 70-odd years later. And of course, no one questions Euclidean geometry. It comes from that. So it's one of the earliest theoretical chemistries. He used that context as Francis Cornford in 1937 put it on his cosmology, and he uses the word intelligent design. He accepts that there's chaos, he accepts there's determinism, but he says we see these recurrent patterns of order They occur at these very low levels where you have these solids come together. They build what we would call now atoms and molecules and macromolecules and so forth. And for his argument, which would be my argument, which I think would also not necessarily be Lima de Faria's argument, but where I would agree with him, is that yes, there are these intrinsic capacities of matter to form these higher levels of organization, but I think that's compatible with a design that's not necessarily one that's of a theological nature, but it's one that we can infer from the logic and mathematics of the reactions that are occurring. So that doesn't bother me at all. There are many proponents of self-organization theory, like Stuart Kauffman, the former Brian Goodwin, and the whole school, which I used to belong to, called structuralism, of which Lima de Faria was part of that. And as I remember having a conversation with Lenny Moss, and he said there's a significant intersection, a non-empty intersection or overlap between what is going on in fields like autopoiesis and some of these other genetic network theories, self-organization theory, and some branches of intelligent design. So I really have no problems with it, either philosophically or scientifically. Yes.
Thank you. Michael.
I'm happy to ask questions. Would it not be better to have them ask us a question, or you want us to do? Okay, well.
You don't like to ask?
I'm going to ask a question. Well, I've got two questions. First of all, Mike, how do your colleagues deal with the fact that you're the most famous member of the department?
They hate it. I remember one of my colleagues pretty much spitting on the floor, saying, Lehigh is, you're the face of Lehigh, and people don't like that one bit. Yeah, I am not popular in my department. I generally talk with my colleagues about the Philadelphia Eagles football team and the baseball teams, and we steer clear of the topic of intelligent design.
I do want to say that I think this is one of the wonderful things about tenure. I disagree with you entirely, but I think it's very important that professors be given that kind of, as it were, guarantee. I mean, if you're doing something morally wrong, that's different. But I think that you've got ideas that none of us share, I think is another matter. So let me say that I might do some spitting, but I wouldn't show you the door.
Thank you.
Now, the question I've got for both of you guys is, how do you deal with things which are not very nice? Things like the Tay-Sachs disease or sickle cell anemia. I mean, your God is their intelligent designer. They're doing all sorts of wonderful, complex things. Mm-hmm. What kind of God is this that lets small children die in agony from anemia, sickle cell anemia?
Okay, let me start, but I'm sure Plato had something to say about it. I don't care. I don't care what God does. I don't care,
Be very careful. He might be listening.
Well, yeah, good. God can take care of himself. I'm a biochemist, and it's my job to explain or point out things like molecular machinery and how they don't fit into a Darwinian picture and so on. Nonetheless, there are bad things in the world, and one is sickle cell, which I did my PhD thesis on, and which I agree is a splendid example of Darwinian evolution. That is, it could be the single tiny change in a huge complex molecule, hemoglobin, allows it to aggregate, and that confers some resistance to malaria on people who have it and people who live in Africa. The way I envision it, seriously, is, suppose that, an architect made a stage with props and things and allowed life to play out on it, like an improvisational theater. If there weren't a stage, if there weren't props, there could be no play. But on the stage, people can act out, they can have free will, they can do many different things that they otherwise could not. There could be real danger, there could be real evil, there could be real good, and so on. So I'm not a theologian, I don't worry too much about it, but I don't think this view is the big problem for Christianity that you seem to think.
Well, I think that's a bit of a cop-out. I mean, you're appealing to intelligent design. That's not, is this science or is this theology? And it sounds to me very much like theology. You're talking about a divine being of infinite intelligence and ability who is making the bacterial flagellum. So you're appealing to something. This is not I mean, you're not going to win the Nobel Prize for chemistry for doing this. You might get a nice letter from the Pope, but as I say, I think that's a bit of a cop-out to say that.
Well, I disagree, and I'll be brief so that Rick can get in on it. You may remember, you were probably there, in the 1930s, when...
Not that old!
When the Big Bang Theory was first proposed. The Big Bang Theory disturbed a lot of scientists. A lot of physicists hated it because it seemed to point to a beginning to the universe which seemed to have theological implications. But nonetheless, physicists, for the most part, a lot of them didn't like it, but they overcame that and they worked on it, and the result turned out happy. In my view, we see design. We see these purposeful arrangement of parts. We see complexity and elegance and sophistication way beyond anything that can be explained by any theory on offer today. And I think it is a dereliction of duty for a biochemist to ignore that because it might have disturbing philosophical implications.
But you see, again, my point is, let's take something which is close to home. Hitler invading Poland at the beginning of September 1939. Now this, at one level, is a physical, psychological thing. And yet, I think it has theological implications. I think that you can't just simply, let's take Himmler, who caused all those terrible things just down the road at Auschwitz. I mean, these have theological implications. And I just want to say, I think your work has theological implication in a way that I don't think you can draw it, but I don't think Richard Dawkins is drawing theological implications from selfish genes.
Rick, you go ahead.
That is absolute nonsense. I want to take issue.
Be very careful. There's a lot of clergymen here, talking about nonsense.
Well, I think that's nonsense, and so in response to that, number one, I have no opinions on theodicy. And so for me, you cannot go from an argument for intelligent design to making arguments about the nature of God and or whatever exists in in a transcendent realm. So that. But where I think you are being disingenuous is here. If you read The Origin of Species, a lot of Darwin's argument is theological. It's about what God would not have done. Had God created this, it would have been this way. As one, I remember Priest years ago, and it was in response to Michael Behe's book. He said, you can read Darwin, and it is a product of decadent Western theology, where you had this almost quasi-deistic notion and these conceptions that, yeah, well, God would have done it this way, we don't see it that, therefore, God was not involved in the process. And that's the origin of species, and certainly you know that. When I read Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene in 1976, there was a theology all through it. In fact, there's a blatant contradiction before us, and it's this, that someone like Michael, or someone like myself, or Stephen Meyer, is committing a tremendous error, because we're looking at the natural world, we're drawing conclusions, and somehow we have crossed a boundary into the realm of theology. But what does Dawkins do? He's presented book after book after book, hence, and the New Atheists would be another example of this, where they come out and they say, we see X, Y, and Z. Yes, we have Tay-Sachs disease. Yes, we have this. Yes, you had Himmler, and you have all these things. You had all the Ukrainians killed under Stalin, and therefore, there is no God. I mean, that's essentially the argument of New Atheism. That's what made people like Sam Harris noticeable. And somehow, you will go after the intelligent design people, and you'll say, you're crossing the boundary, but you won't say one damn thing when it's the other side doing that. And I find that disingenuous.
Well, on a matter of historical correction, Darwin's only theological claim in The Origin of Species comes in the last chapter, where he says, in my opinion, a world which works according to unbroken law is more, I forget what the word is, but it makes God look better than otherwise. So Darwin, that's not a theological book. I mean, Darwin had theological interests, but that's not a theological book. You see, this is the problem I have with you and with Michael Behe. You keep saying, oh no, no theological implication. You people are suggesting, hypothesizing, whatever it is, an intelligent designer. And that means you're positing something which is not normal, not material, which is in the spirit world of some kind, of a particular kind. In other words, it's pretty clever. It's going to get A's from all the courses. Well, perhaps not from me, but it is. So I think you are committed to a belief in some kind of theological entity.
Not necessarily, no. I think one could be, I know several people who are frankly irreligious. They will not make really any statement. They really could care less about God at all. They'll be willing to wait, I guess, to see what happens after they expire. And at the same time, they are advocates of design. David Berlinski would be an example of that. So I think the error you're making is that you're painting with a very broad brush a very diverse collection of ideas. And to simply try to put it into some box and to cast it as bad philosophy, bad theology, that we look at the flagellum and therefore we want to start musing about the nature of the Godhead. Mike doesn't do that. Maybe a few people do. I don't do that. So I just see that, in a debate context like this, it's a very simple thing to do. It's erection of a straw man. And my views on intelligent design are markedly different from many other views. I'm not a Paleyite, for example. I don't like William Paley's argument. There are many other arguments where they'll say we see X, Y, and Z, and therefore now let's turn to the book of Psalms. I don't like that either. Yes, you can do that. So you're painting things with a very broad brush. Yes, it's very good in a debate context like this, but it's erroneous. In fact, I reject most of the labeling that you have done. And I just want to put that straight. That it's just incorrect to do so. And the argument of somehow, yes, you have Tay-Sachs disease, yes, you've had wars going on from time immemorial, and yes, the 20th century was extremely horrible. But despite all of that, there are significant and very fundamental questions of things like, how did self-replication start in the first place? That's an open question in autopoiesis. Self-replication is a very complicated topic. When you have, for example, theoretical physicists and others, they broach it. They realize that there are. Someone cut me off. Am I? Yeah.
No.
So you have these very open questions, and these are at the foundational level. They precede, both logically and materially, what is necessary for something like Darwinian evolution to occur. You've got to have self-replication in the first place. You've got to have ability to generate variation. Then and only then can you invoke something like natural selection. So you have to have that ability. Reproduction and the generation of variation, by accident or whatever. And yes, are there a lot of accidents? Of course there are. It's because when you deal with matter and you have all these configurations that can adopt, the vast majority of things that are going to arise are simply going to be, yes, they're going to be non-functional, yes, they're going to be, I mean, we see it all the time. So there's no issue about that. But there are these issues of replication in particular, like self-replication. I mean, those who tackled it, John von Neumann, beginning in the 1930s and 1940s, others in the 1950s and 1960s, when they thought long and hard of it. I'm thinking of individuals like Erwin Schrödinger, I'm thinking of Werner Heisenberg, I'm thinking another, David Bohm, much later on. They realized that this is something for which, given quantum mechanics, given classical mechanics, you cannot as yet explain. I look at the literature from those who are studying for like autopoiesis, Francisco Varela and others like that. I like autopoiesis. But nevertheless, when they look at it logically and mathematically, what's clear is that classical logic and classical mathematics will not explain what we see in living systems. And all of this is antecedent to any argument for natural selection. So for me, I don't have an issue with common descent. I don't have an issue with anything that you presented. What I do have an issue with is the process that explained that. Do I want to invoke God coming in every second and fiddling with DNA or something like that? No. I actually like things like what Lima de Faria and others have proposed. I'm perfectly comfortable with that. What I think, though, is that when you look at it from a mathematical standpoint, a number of very intriguing paradoxes arise, and they require thought. They do not require broad brush approaches. They do not require, and I think it's pure obfuscation to be going into things that happened in World War II, and then also talking about, I'm talking too long, intelligent design and the bacterial flagellum.
Well, let me pick up one more thing, and I don't want to squeeze others out of the discussion. Go ahead.
You guys have asked all the questions so far. We didn't get a chance to ask.
Well, then, go ahead. Oh,
I have a question for Professor Malgorzata. I apologize for my pronunciation.
Perfect.
Much of your description of the unfolding of life, it's sounded fine to me. It's very interesting, and I wondered I had no difficulty with that, but the main distinction of Darwin, as you know, a number of people proposed evolutionary schemes before Darwin. He did it in the most detail, but his greatest claim to fame is that he thought he identified a process that could explain life without any intelligent direction. That, as you said, uses physics and chemistry and laws of nature and so on. But I didn't hear you explaining how you knew that was the case, that there was no intelligence. So let me preface my question with a little example that I think I mentioned already, that that experiment of Richard Lenski's, the microbiologist from Michigan State, which is the best evolution experiment that has ever been done, where he grew bacteria in his lab for over 70,000 generations, and they improved quite a bit. But when he eventually was able to sequence the bacteria and identify the beneficial mutation, he found they were pretty much all degradative mutations, ones that either broke or damaged genes. So why should we think that the processes that you describe, or the events that you describe, were completely due to unintelligent processes?
First of all, we should not refer to the Darwinian theory as it was formulated 164 years ago, because we know different things. Second point, we could not apply mathematical equations, statistics, because mathematics does not refer to all biological systems. So pure mathematical equations do not apply to biological systems, not all of them. Another point, thermodynamic rules. They do not apply to biological systems because the organisms are open systems. Thermodynamic clearly applies to closed systems. So we could not try to find contra or pro argument using calculations. This is totally methodologically wrong, and it will never prove anything or disprove anything. Now, you mentioned that through enormous amount of individuals and generations of bacteria, nothing happened, no mutations. One single point, which is that those are prokaryotes. And we know from biology that prokaryotes have very slow tempo of evolution. They don't change. If we look at the fossil record of prokaryotic cells, we see them through the hundreds of millions of years. So how could you, doing experiments, expect that in 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, letting them go, you will find mutation? This is as well a wrong assumption. Another point which I would like to make is that in the same way as 164 years we didn't know many things which we know now, today we still do not know many things, and I am certain that they will be discovered, inferred, deduced, or whatever, which may perhaps help us to better explain what we observe in the nature. So this is an open field. And another point, referring to mutations. In reality, the accelerated evolution and fast change of rate and tempo of evolution is observed in the reality in eukaryotic organisms. And this was some kind of, accelerated evolution of tempo was proposed many years ago. It was from Simpson and Dinol and others. What we really observe, if we look at the geological time of the changes of the organisms, our taxon, our species, Homo sapiens, is only 200,000 years ago. So it is a very short period of time. But still, in this time, how much we change. We diversified, we radiated from our sister group, Homo neanderthaliensis, just 200,000 years ago, and the other species became extinct. We are developing. And what is diagnostic for our mind is that we have mind, we have intellect, we have spiritual life. We are searching for explanation of the world around, and we don't find all the answers. And some people look to find comfort, spiritual life, experiences of life in God, in religion, or and it was always, as we know, the human being evolved, they always have beliefs. And I believe that I would like to make a point here that we should make a very clear distinction. What we are dealing in scientific methodology, studies, and so on, and inferences, which are still not perfect, not answering everything. And separate domain is our spirituality of our mind, and there is no conflict between both regimes, science and belief or God, because those are different domains and they rather could coexist instead of fighting. But I find it difficult to accept intelligent design because for me personally is kind of hybrid. It is, sorry for the harsh words, pseudoscience, pseudo-religion. So why to do this? I would rather see we do science, and if we don't know much about this, we don't mess with science. We have belief, and we follow our belief because it makes we believe, and this is needed for our spiritual life, and this could be separated but not conflictive. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I make a follow-up question? Thanks very much. I appreciate that. It's interesting that you say that we've moved well beyond Darwin, of course, since the 160 some odd years since he wrote his book. But I think the nice thing about Richard Lenski's experiment is that the bacteria weren't required to mutate or to evolve by Darwin's theory. They didn't ask anybody how to evolve. All he did was to look to see what happened. So if self-organization or some epigenetic stuff or other proposed mechanisms of evolution were working, then they could have worked in his flasks over the tens of thousands of generations, over the trillions of cells that were produced. But instead, they degraded. It's not that they just kind of swam around and didn't change. They went south. They lost at least 40 genes and were on a strong road to extinction. And that's what they do, essentially, when we watch them. So the question is, why should we think that left to itself, nature will do something different? And let me say again, to me, again, no offense certainly intended, but your citing of the human fossil record and human evolution seems to be begging the question. You're assuming that why these developments must have happened by some undirected process, but you cited no evidence to support that. So I guess I'd ask you to comment on that. And also, do you think that science should be more open to the public? Because in most discussions, scientists or science organizations give the impression that they've got the matter pretty well in hand. And yet, from what I hear and people I talk to, people don't have a clue as to how fundamental changes could take place.
First of all, I believe that this is a very good idea, and it should be, that science is open and open to criticism, to different ideas, and accept different stands of human being, like God, religion, and other beliefs. But in the same way, I believe that all the processes, thus far as we can see or infer, because we don't see, we infer, deduce from fossil records and observing today, genetics and molecular biology, all those processes do not need really any design, or, frankly speaking, we don't see that it was directional, purposeful, or goal. What is the goal? Our human species will, like all the other which were living in the past and living today, will be extinct. This is absolutely predictable. So we are not very different than other species. Let me give you the example. If we look at our favorite dinosaurs or reptiles, when we look at their adaptation, mode of life, they were walking, running, swimming, and flying. They had perfect adaptations to environment, marine, terrestrial. They were herbivorous there, they were carnivorous. And then random incident or accident, bolite, which changed the environments, killed the plants, and as a chain reaction, those reptiles which were herbivorous became extinct because it was not enough food. Those which were carnivorous and ate herbivorous extinct because there were no herbivores, and they became extinct. But it was not bad at all, because in fact they left the ecological niches open and free for mammals. And mammals took advantage because they occupied the niches which previously were occupied by reptiles and dinosaurs, evolved very fast, and as the last species, we came to well-being. So in reality, this is the example of random event which may reset and change the evolution. And this is answer that, of course, what Darwin long time ago saying that, oh, it was stepwise and slow. This was a long time ago. We know now that evolution had events and happenings, fast and slow, gradual and sudden. So there is a diversity of mechanism and happenings. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. O zadanie pytania poproszę doktora Sternberga.
All right.
Bardzo proszę.
Some questions?
Tak, oczywiście.
Yes, well, I have a question for you. And you mentioned, so you've classified ID as a pseudo-religion and pseudo-science. Oh, no, it's okay. Those are actually very kind words compared to many that one could receive.
You don't think that you're a real human being, do you? I thought you were a pseudo.
Okay, well, again, I've been called worse by far worse people. So, yes, and I hold you in high regard. So this is, anyway. Anyway, the question, first, I have a question for you, and that is, so we have, you put it as pseudo-religion and pseudo-science. The world is awash in pseudo-religions and pseudo-sciences. And, you know, in the United States, for example, I'm sure this is also true in Western, Central, Eastern Europe, wherever you would go, you have all kinds of people. You have your Deepak Chopras, and you have, you know, their quantum mechanics, and they're trying to create some mystical babble out of that. Why is there not a reaction to that? I mean, there are people who hunt ghosts, there are people who search for UFOs, there are people, for example, who they want to explore psychic phenomena, and guess what the reaction is? Who gives a damn? And then all of a sudden, you have someone that they advocate intelligent design, or when it came to the fore, and you get this very strong reaction. And so, why do other pseudo-religions, here's my question, why do other pseudo-religions and other pseudo-sciences get off with a free pass, and suddenly intelligent design, there's this hostile reaction to it? Why is that?
I will not answer why the other pseudo-scientific or pseudo-religious trends are not criticized, because I would criticize them, but I will not answer for anybody else. And because I was invited to speak with you, so I express my opinion about the intelligent design. And as I said before, I would rather be more comfortable to have the divergence or ramification. We have science we have religion. And, as I said, needn't to be conflict, but why to introduce the third component, intelligent design, which is very enigmatic. Who or what was this intelligent designer? What was the purpose? What was the goal? What is the goal, you know, for this?
But you could say the same thing with the Big Bang theory. Who started that Big Bang? What was the purpose of that? You know, why, how can science, you know, tolerate a beginning to the universe? Many physicists said exactly that in the 1930s. And I think the answer is because that's what it looks like. The evidence looks like the galaxies are moving away after a large explosion, and bacteria flagella and ATP synthase and kinesin motors and molecular machinery, let alone macroscopic things, look very strongly to be designed, that the processes that we talk about here are extremely vaguely described, if I may say so, right here. There, in no one case have I heard a detailed explanation for any significantly complex structural trait. So that's why I hold up intelligent design.
Yeah, I was. What prompted that question is that in my way back when I used to take military classes, you know, there's an old adage, and not in the Air Force, but in the Army, there's an old adage that the Air Force uses that you don't receive flak or heavy anti-aircraft weaponry unless you're over a significant target. In other words, if you're just flying over some non-strategic countryside, you can get by that. But you go over some major area, then all of a sudden, that's when the heavy batteries of fire comes in. And when intelligent design, a la Michael here, when it was first rolled out, I'll be honest, I was not keen on it at all. I just wasn't. But what did intrigue me was to see the hostile, knee-jerk reaction to it, at least in the United States. I don't know about in Europe, everywhere. So that's what prompted that why do you have all these why can you have these pseudo-mystical notions derived from quantum mechanics, and people just roll their eyes and say, yeah, you can, that's so fine. And then suddenly you have someone saying, well, I see the flagellum and it's very complicated, and here's my hypothesis or theory, and all of a sudden it's, you know, shall we say, the idea hits the fan. I'll just leave it like that, not to step on any toes. Now, I do have a question for Professor Ruse, and that is this. Is there anything that you could possibly conceive of, any piece of empirical evidence, so I'm not speaking of anything metaphysical, but say a discovery that would cause you to change your mind on the status of ID?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's a fair question. I would certainly need to have more than you've got. I'd need to have being able to pin down when the intelligent designer was working, and if it's a long time ago, why it is that the intelligent designer's work is not wiped out by mutations or selective forces or all of these sorts of things. Now, I'm not sure, even then, I'd want to say it's an intelligent designer, but I certainly would want to concede that there's something there out of the ordinary. So I'm prepared to go at least that far. Whether I go further, I'm not sure. But can I just correct you folks? Pseudoscience, pseudo-religion has always got people angry, hot under the collar. So don't think that you folks are being picked out. The vestiges of creation, the anonymously authored book on evolution by, as we know now, Robert Chambers, was published in 1844. You should see what Adam Sedgwick, the professor of geology, said about it. You should see what David Brewster, the biographer of Newton, eminent Scottish physicist, said about it. You should see what Thomas Henry Huxley said about it. So there's a case. These things do go. And spiritualism, I mean, Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection, declared for spiritualism in the middle of the 1860s. He told Darwin, and Darwin said, oh my God, you've really screwed up our theory. And so what did Darwin do? He sat down then and stopped fiddling around with orchids, which is what he was doing, and wrote The Descent of Man. So I argue strongly that you people are not being picked out, as it were, uniquely. You are being picked out. I'm not denying that. But as I say, I would challenge the view that, as it were, you are being persecuted in a way that other, whether you call it pseudoscience, pseudo-religion people are not. So I think this is an ongoing thing. But as I say, going back to the other thing, I need just a lot more evidence. I mean, if the heavens opened up and a big voice said, this is, my beloved, what shall we say, bacterium flagellum, in which I am well satisfied, then at least I think I go home and have a couple of very big drinks and think about that one. But that doesn't happen.
The odd thing, though, which you can see very early on after the origin of species, but so 1859, was the reaction to any argument, evolutionary argument, that somehow did not fit the Darwinian mold. So, for example, was rereading St. George Mivart, his, the 1870, 1871 book, which got him into hot water. That book today, and I agree with his arguments, he wasn't arguing against common descent, he wasn't arguing against that. Actually, what he proposed, he actually invoked Herbert Spencer, his 1864 Principles of Biology, and really what it was a self-organization theory. That he was saying you need this before you get selection. What we later call the arrival of the fittest as opposed to the survival of the fittest. I think that's how, I think it was Leo Buss who put it that way. So going to that comment, why, a different question is why did you suddenly have this? Darwin comes and he presents his arguments, and he wants them received with an open mind. But then you have someone, say, like a Richard Owen, who had his own quasi-evolutionary views, and you had a number of others. And then there was this very sharp reaction by Huxley and others. What is it? Why is it lip service paid to open-mindedness, but if something doesn't fit within that Procrustean bed, so to speak, laid out, the auxiliary hypotheses have to be cut out and shouted down. Why is that?
Well, first of all, I want to question that everybody's always, in every way, against these, call it pseudoscience, pseudo-religion. I have I'm sure, the unique experience of having contributed to the Festschrift of Philip Johnson, as it were, the founder of intelligent design. I have also contributed to the Festschrift of Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene guy, and I did it in the same year. So, it isn't always completely, utterly like that. But I think, for instance, you bring in Huxley. We're talking about Thomas Henry Huxley now. Not Julian Huxley. And I think you have to look at the situation. And why did Huxley react in the ways that he did? In fact, in many respects, it had little to do with evolution. He was intent on founding a secular science, which in the 1830s, it was all done at Oxford and Cambridge by people who had to be members, ordained members of the Church of England. And Huxley wanted a secular science, which he got in what is now called Imperial College down in West Kensington. So, as I say, I think you have to look at these. Why would somebody emote so strongly about this? And why would somebody else say, you know, all right, you want to believe that kind of, if I can use a technical philosophical term, that kind of bullshit, then nobody's going to stop you, and that's fine. But don't bother us, and don't try and get any grants from us. So I think you have to be very careful about these. Now, in the case of intelligent design, I think I can speak, you know, with some authority here. What happened was after Sputnik in 1957, was it? The Americans realized that their science education was lousy. Within days, they said, the Russians have done this, why couldn't we do it? Because we don't have good science education. So they revised science education, biological curriculum. And what was in the biology thing? Evolution. And that, of course, brought on the creationists, fundamentalists, and it brought on Genesis Flood by Whitcomb and Morris. And then right through the 70s, creationism was doing really, really well. I mean, one of the reasons is you'd have Morris and Gish debating a couple of biologists. And the trouble was, Morris and Gish were very good debaters. And the biologists would get up and they go on and on and on and on and on. And then they say, cut off. Well, I haven't got to my main point yet. And then the voting would come in. I was involved in one. I think it was 5,000 for Morris and Gish and 10 for me. But then, of course, what happened in 1981, we had a trial in Arkansas, because Arkansas had passed a bill saying, if you teach evolution, you must have balanced treatment. And that was overturned, and witnesses like Francisco Ayala and Steve Gould and me, it was overturned. So, but what happened then, I think, is the creationists, as it were, regrouped and said, we're not going to be able to do it this way. We can't do it this way. So one of the things is, you know, you work on school boards and things like that. But another thing is you have to present creationism in a more scientific manner, less threatening, if you like. And that, of course, was Philip Johnson's genius. I mean, Phil Johnson was a lawyer, not a biologist. And then, of course, people like you and Dembski and others picked up on this. So I see intelligent design theory not some new thing. I see it as something with a long history, which has been debated again and again and again. So,
okay, can I ask a question, or should I respond? Let me just ask Professor Malgorzata. I'm really curious, because one of the big problems for evolution, as I see it, is to get multiple things that are necessary for some feature together. The simplest one is something called a disulfide bond. In chemistry, a disulfide bond is just two sulfurs coming together to form a covalent bond, and some proteins do that with residues called cysteine residues. And a while back, 10, 15 years ago, a man named Eugene Koonin essentially said that we have no idea, how evolution could produce a thing. And this disulfide bond, it's kind of, you can make an analogy to, say, a latch on a gate. It strikes me that many Darwinists, many scientists say, we can explain the flagellum, we can explain the outboard motor inside this cabin here. We just have trouble explaining the latch on the gate. But if you can't explain an easier thing, you can't explain the harder one. That's kind of a lead up to me asking, can you pick out some complex interactive system, you know, a mousetrap if you want, or something else, and just explain kind of in step by step how you think it could, by an unintelligent happenstance plus selection, how you think something like that could arise?
You're asking me?
No, I believe it was the question. First of all, we have no answer to everything, and we have no all the steps to every process. This is the fact, and we are not trying to pretend it is. On the other hand, we have examples how those step-by-step reactions are happening. And I mentioned in my presentation the Colby cycle, how the most simple bonds between the carbon atoms are forming. So this is the first step to produce more complex molecules. One additional factor which works on the evolutionary processes is enormous timeline and enormous amount of repeated reactions. Some fail, some will succeed, and this is what gives the opportunity in nature through long period of time, through robust reactions, to come finally to next step, and from very simple to very complex. And again, I am not saying that we have answer to all the steps, not at all. But let me turn into how science works and how sometimes we can explain the legend. Why I mention it? Because we are here in Cracow, where we have the Wawel Castle. And for several hundreds of years, there was a legend that there was the dragon living under the castle, and it was called Smok Wawelski. And people believed that, well, there was a dragon who was eating young virgins. What appeared just a few years ago, that actually the Smok Wawelski, Wawel dragon, was described as a fossil. It happens that very peculiar bones were found in the pit clay in the locality Lisice in Silesia, and those were reconstructed as a very primitive dinosaur. This is dated to 200 million years. And then we realize how the idea and legend about this, and the fossil is actually called Smok Wawelski, genus Smok, Wawelski species. And then it is very easy to imagine. In ancient time, people who were collecting the clay from the pit to produce brick to construct the houses, they found in different places as well very peculiar, large, bizarre bones. How they could explain. The bones did not fit horse, cow, sheep, pig. So what it was? Smoke, dragon. But now we know that it was a dinosaur. So this is the anecdote, but as well a real story that with the time perhaps you will find better understanding and better explanation of what we observe. So long live Smok Wawelski.
Could I just say one little thing? Sorry, guys. Okay, that's a charming story. I'm not sure it's directly to the point, but let me go back to where you were talking about carbon bonds, though.
Bravo, bravo.
You say carbon bonds, carbon can form bonds with other molecules, and that's certainly correct. But as I'm sure you know, the origin of life studies, chemical origin of life, has had a lot of problems over the years. Yeah. There's one fellow, Eugene Koonin, I think I mentioned his name before. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a prominent fellow. And he said that he thinks that the origin of life on Earth is so unlikely that it would take an area of the universe about 10 to the 1,000th power larger than what we observe right now to get life started by random processes. Okay, my question is simple. What do you know about the origin of life that he does not know?
First of all, you again apply mathematical calculations, how long it should take. It's needing to be correct.
But it's chemistry, it's not biology.
Yes, but you know, chemistry, but as well conditions which were existing and which perhaps are not existing now, that you can repeat the same chemical reactions. But anyway, it's a speculation. We will never know for certain how life originated. Those are inferences from the information which is available now. Perhaps in the future we will know more about this. What Eugene Koonin was referring is not argument whatsoever.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Mike, can I just...
Szanowni Państwo,
Oh, no.
ostatnie 3 minuty, Szanowni
Okay.
Państwo, dobrze? Musimy trzymać się ram czasowych niestety.
You say, if you like.
Yes? No?
Somebody,
Oh,
Mike
the question.
would like
to- Okay.
Let me ask the basic question, though, going back
it has.
to where you were 15 minutes ago. What we evolutionists criticize you over is that you go and you look at something functioning, like the bacterial flagellum, and you say, and of course your mousetrap example is supposed to back this up. You say, if you take parts away, it don't work. So natural selection couldn't have done it because natural selection would have to put it all together at one point, and natural selection doesn't work that way. And of course, what Darwinians want to say, what Darwinians want to say is that no, the point is things aren't just put together just like that biologically. You get this, you get that, you get something else, and then they, for various reasons, they start functioning together, and then some of the steps that led to this are no longer needed. So selection gets rid of them. I mean, the Krebs cycle, it's been called a bricolage. It's something which is just put together. And I go back to my very simple, but I think very important example of the stone bridge, the Keystone Stone Bridge, which if you try to do it, as it were, building it up like this, you can't do it. You just can't do it. But you put an embankment and then put the stones around it and get them in place and then get rid of the embankment, then it works. And I know that that's exactly the kind of argument that Darwinians would give to somebody like you. We're not denying, we're not denying that if we took parts out of the bacterial flagellum, it wouldn't work. And of course, your mousetrap example is supposed to show us the same. And nobody's denying that. Nobody's denying that. What we're denying is that necessarily it must have been put together in one fell swoop, which of course Darwinism says you're not going to get the Krebs cycle, as it were, with one mutation or something like that. And so you have to look at these things historically and see how they were put together. And often you've got the bits still functioning elsewhere. And then you start to build a picture out of that way. And that's perfectly good natural selection. So basically, Mike, I think what we'd say is you're pointing to very important, very interesting aspects of the biological world, but that you're inferring something which we don't have to infer.
let me just make a quick reply. First of all, your embankment example with the bridge, you're anticipating the bridge. You're essentially building a scaffold for it. So that's even further intelligent design than just putting a simple bridge together. Number two is,
I think you've got to. Did you pay these people?
That's all my family out there. The second is that, okay, that's fine for a Darwinist to come back and say, yeah, well, we think that there were other things, it did other things, things hopped on and off. Okay, great, but that's hardly a proposal. That's so vague that it can't count as a scientific proposal. What you have to do is say, well, what were those? Or do an experiment like, say, Richard Lenski, and see if a bacterial flagellum or something on its way to it or something on its way to other complex system starts to appear. But again, as I've mentioned before, in the 25 years since I pointed to this example, there have been no real scientific papers investigating how that thing could have arisen, either indirectly or directly or by co-option, by whatever mechanism you want to propose. There have been no proposals. And that by itself, the utter silence, the utter absence of work in the area speaks extremely strongly to the fruitlessness of the Darwinian paradigm for complex cellular systems.
Well, I'm not a biologist, so you're right. I can't cite papers which do this sort of thing. But I do ask the audience, and it doesn't need clapping, I ask the audience, go to the computer, look at Wikipedia, look at bacterial flagellum under it, and I'll bet that you will find that there have been papers which have dealt with that sort of thing. Now, you've all got the chance. You can go home, you can look at it, and you can say, yeah, Mike Behe was absolutely right. Michael Ruse was full of it. But I bet it won't happen that way.
I have a question for either of you, or both of you can respond. Can there be Darwinian evolution in general, or excuse me, in particular, or any evolution in general without natural selection?
No. Because we have evidence that natural selection works.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Saul Wright introduced genetic drift, and that was very popular in the 30s and 40s. But then people said, we don't need it. I mean, very interesting to look at Dobzhansky's Genetics and the Origin of Species, first edition, 1937, which uses genetic drift a huge amount, and third edition, 1951, which doesn't use genetic drift at all. So by and large, I think that they would say that it's natural selection which is at work. What they would not say, though, is that natural selection always makes things work for the best. Yes, usually it does. But Darwin and since him have been adamant that there's no necessary progression. I mean, for instance, you may say, but look, it's created human beings. Does anybody here think that in the, let's say, 20,000 years, there is not going to be a neo-Putin who lets off atomic bombs, and so a year or two later, all we've got is insects? I mean, if you do, you're a lot more optimistic than I am. I just, when I see the madness of somebody like Putin, the absolute madness of going into Ukraine, I mean, I just don't think we've advanced that much. And given the weapons we've got, I'm certainly not optimistic that in the next, as I say, 20,000 years, we're not going to be wiped out. Time's up.
Well, the reason I asked that question, I'm going to interject, is just one thing, is that you have to have a certain breeding population size for natural selection to have traction, and that's roughly 10 to the 8th individuals. Otherwise, you end up with a near neutral evolution. And you've got a large school of thought in evolutionary theory, Michael Lynch, et cetera, that argues that in the case of many plants, in the case of mammals, in the case of birds, the population sizes are simply too small and that therefore the explanation is some kind of, you could call it genetic drift, many do, and there is such a thing as genetic drift. You see it with species that are endangered, but that essentially it is just a near neutral process. That selection works well with bacteria and viruses, works well with fruit flies, but when you get to something like, for example, certain orchid species where you may have hundreds of thousands of plants that are reproducing, but not in the millions or billions, then all of a sudden selection doesn't have traction. So you do have a school of thought, and it's not a negligible school of thought, saying that natural selection, when we get to multicellular life, is not the explanation. It is something akin to genetic drift. And I find that curious, that if selection is the engine, then why does it cut off when you get to metazoans, in many of them?
Well, I gave the example recently published in Nature 1 month ago about the example of natural selection working in the skyfish and shark. And it was studied by the genetic relatedness, replication or exchange of nucleotides and duplication of genomes. And it was definitely called that natural selection worked in a way of environment adaptation. Skatefish adopted to the benthic life in the marine environments, shark free swimming, but they derive from the same ancestor, and they split it, they selected for different environments. And that was called natural selection. And I'm just citing the example which I took from the literature.
I tutaj musimy, drodzy Państwo, postawić kropkę, może nie kropkę, ale bardziej wielokropek. Bardzo dziękujemy naszym prelegentom za tak ożywioną debatę i ogromną dawkę wiedzy. Z wielką przyjemnością, drodzy Państwo, tak jest, proszę o brawa. Ja jestem swoją drogą bardzo ciekawy, czy Państwa wątpliwości, z którymi dzisiaj Państwo przyszli na to nasze wydarzenie, zostały w jakikolwiek sposób rozwiane. Domyślam się, że pewnie nie. Najprawdopodobniej, więc to jest ten moment, w którym, drodzy Państwo, Wy macie teraz możliwość i okazję zadawania pytań. I tutaj taka prośba, drodzy Państwo, osoby, które są chętne, prosimy do podejścia po pierwsze tutaj do naszego mikrofonu na sali. Proszę powiedzieć, do którego z prelegentów skierowane jest pytanie i ze względu na niestety ograniczenia czasowe bardzo prosimy o w miarę możliwości zwięzłe pytania. Proszę ojca, proszę bardzo.
And I want to say, I've had so much fun the last 2.5 hours, and I think we've had a wonderful discussion. So I want to thank Arche for doing this and all the people who were behind that. Thank you very much.
Pierwsze pytanie, prosimy bardzo. Działa.
Professor Ruse, I have got a question for you. So you said in your initial statement that the existence of evil is the argument against intelligent design, because if there is a good designer or God, there wouldn't be evil. And then by the end of your presentation you claim that either there is no God or God is in everything, meaning that He works in every aspect of nature. I understand that you side with the latter solution, so that God is in everything, and therefore we can say He's not distinctive by intelligent design. But then my question is how your take on God's involvement in everything resolves the issue, the question of evil. So why there is evil if God is in everything? Thank you.
Well, no, I'll leave it to you folks.
He asked you,
What's the question exactly? I was having trouble following.
how does it resolve the problem of evil if God is controlling everything?
Well, I mean, there are all sorts of arguments about that, starting with you Christians and the idea of Adam and Eve sinning and, we're tainted with original sin and it's not God's fault. I mean, I'll mention Himmler again. Himmler is not God's fault. It's those people who ate the apple way back when. So I would say there are lots of explanations like that, including the fact you might say he's a good God, but he doesn't want us just to sit on our bottoms and have a good time. He wants us to struggle, to have to work. And you Poles of anybody know exactly what I'm saying. You've not had it easy in the last 100 years, but I think you've come through in a very noble way. And so I, for one, have a hell of a lot more respect for Poland than I would, let's say, 200 years ago, because I think you've faced terrible challenges, and none of us always do the best that we ever can, but I think overall, you're pretty good. And with this wretched thing going on in Ukraine, if I'm going to list 5 nations which are doing something about it, I would certainly say America, but I would also say Poland. So,
but my question was more direct regarding the evil in the world, but more like natural evil, like sickle cell disease, because your argument was about intelligent design would preclude this kind of evil, natural evil, not human-caused evil.
Well, as I said, this is my problem with intelligent design.
That's
Why
right,
do
but
you
your
have...
solution was that God is present in everything. Precisely for this reason, we cannot recognize design because he is in every action of nature. So how does it resolve the question of evil?
Sorry, again, I'm having trouble.
I believe that what Michael referred is that it was a question, is God directing everything, or there is no God at all?
That's right, but I understand that Mr. Ruse is opting for God directing everything.
No.
I don't see any reason why God should not say, this is the way the world's going to work. I don't want humans to live in a world where they just have to do nothing. I want humans to face challenges and come out well, come out badly. But I didn't create everything just for people to sit on their bottoms and play harps. I think that this is a challenge that we have in this life.
Okay, thank you. I don't think I've heard the solution, but thank you.
Dziękujemy bardzo. Bardzo prosimy o kolejne pytanie.
Będę mówił po polsku i mam pytanie do pani profesor. Pytanie i jakąś uwagę na temat tej trudności z połączenia czy zrozumienia tych światów myślicieli ewolucjonistycznych i zwolenników inteligentnego projektu. Mam wrażenie, że nauce towarzyszą przekonania przednaukowe, takie filozoficzne. I mam wrażenie, że pani profesor ma takie pojęcie o rzeczywistości, to jest takie moje założenie, nie wiem czy prawdziwe, że nauka jest jakby, czy świat jest jakby pudełkiem poprzedzielanym przegródkami. I w jednym są klocki, które nazwiemy nauką, w innym są klocki, które nazwiemy filozofią, a w jeszcze innym klocki, które nazwiemy religią. Natomiast wydaje mi się, że problem z tym niezrozumieniem polega na tym, że być może musimy spojrzeć na rzeczywistość jako na te pudełko, gdzie te klocki się stykają ze sobą. Że są takie miejsca we współczesnej nauce, gdzie nauka styka się z filozofią, a czasami nawet z religią. I mamy 2 takie przypadki, jak Wielki Wybuch, gdzie mamy kontakt z materią i światem, który materią nie był wcześniej, czyli takim niebytem po prostu. I mamy też taki kontakt w momencie, kiedy tworzy się z materii nieożywionej materia ożywiona. I pojawiają się pytania. I to nie jest kwestia pseudonauki, tylko to jest kwestia otwartego umysłu, który widzi to zderzenie, to połączenie styku nauki z filozofią. Więc nie jest to pseudonauka. Teoria inteligentnego projektu nie jest pseudonauką, tylko jest po prostu otwartym umysłem. Natomiast pytanie polega na tym, jak zwolennicy teorii Darwina radzą sobie z takim zjawiskiem jak pojawienie się informacji w komórce. Czyli czy nieożywiona materia, aminokwasy są w stanie stworzyć instrukcję obsługi na przykład do pralki. Już nie mówiąc o komórce i organizmie. Czy martwa materia jest w stanie wytworzyć informację, która steruje tak skomplikowanymi procesami? Dziękuję bardzo.
Well, I believe again that pralka has nothing to do with the origin of information.
Can I make one comment? I disagree strongly when you say that science and philosophy are separate. I think science, you make philosophical assumptions in order to do science. I mean, for instance, holism or reductionism is the right way to understand things, to try to break them down into small parts, or is the right way to pull back and try and see the whole holistic picture? And as we know in biology, I mean, I've just written a book about it. As we know in biology, this is a major claim. So certainly I see philosophy and biology as trying to do the same thing. Now, the thing about religion is you're not even playing on the same field. We're playing soccer and you're playing, what shall I say, American football or something like that. And I see religion as trying to give a different kind of answer. Now, as I've said, I don't have the ability to do this, but I'm not going to despise or look down on people who feel that they can. However, despite our clerical friend who felt I didn't do a very good job of answering him, I think that we can actually make critical comments about the various religions. And I can say, no, I don't think that's it. And that's my problem with intelligent design theory.
If I may comment to the question. First of all, we know very well that science, with the methods which are available and the laws which we know, cannot prove or disprove the presence of God. And therefore, I said that we have different domains. Something which we know or will know, and something which we can't prove or disprove. So that's the point. Another, what you mentioned, that intelligent design will see something, prove something, make something of still unknown things. This is the assumption. This is not evidence, this is not scientific method, and this is pure assumption. Thank you.
Okej, drodzy Państwo, taka prośba, bo mamy czas tylko do 21 i tak, Państwa zadających pytania proszę o krótkie pytania, a Państwa odpowiadających proszę o krótkie odpowiedzi. Niestety czas nas goni nieubłaganie. Bardzo prosimy.
I will try to ask question very short, but I will ask in Polish because I have a question to Professor Malgorzata, so most of the people are Polish, so maybe in Polish it's better. Więc moje pytanie jest takie, dlaczego uważa pani profesor, że teoria ewolucji, czy w ogóle jakiś mechanizm ewolucyjny stoi w sprzeczności z inteligentnym projektem? Bo na przykład jeśli weźmiemy pod uwagę prawa fizyki, to one nie ewoluowały. Tak samo jeśli weźmiemy pod uwagę mechanizmy, o których pani mówiła, czyli mechanizm mutacji, losowość czy naturalna selekcja, to nie są mechanizmy, które ewoluowały, tylko one są jakie są. I jeśli chodzi właśnie o tego typu prawa, prawo prawa fizyki, prawa chemii, prawa biologii, one są jakie są i my nie możemy dodać żadnego innego nowego prawa, nie możemy żadnego prawa się pozbyć i nie możemy żadnego prawa ani mechanizmu zmodyfikować. To więc one ewoluowały czy nie? Bo wiem, że nie ewoluowały według mnie, no to były zaprojektowane czy nie były zaprojektowane?
Nie były zaprojektowane i zdecydowanie prawa, perhaps better not to use evolve, but they change because all the laws are constrained by the conditions.
No.
Properties of the, starting with the particles, atoms, molecules, and so on, and conditions. So there is another point that we still do not know all the laws. For example, the black matter, black energy. It exists, it penetrates our everywhere, and we don't understand a damn thing about this. So laws will be as well discovered or not discovered, but there is plenty of things which we don't know. And if we don't know, we don't escape to say, well, it is intelligent design. Thank you.
Okay, but this is not exactly you answered my question because you cannot change the law. The law is as it is.
I don't change the law.
Yeah,
Laws are evolving and changing according to the conditions. Thank you.
No, but laws
Yes?
cannot be changed by the conditions. The conditions are changed by
Their
the
rea-
laws.
No,
This is
the
the opposite.
reaction will be different. The same as I referred to
Dziękujemy.
thermodynamics, isolated or open systems. That's all.
No,
Yes.
this is not true. This is not true.
Oh, it is
The
certain.
laws are constant. No, the laws
No,
are constant.
you are just demagogue.
Okej, dziękujemy bardzo. Poprosimy o kolejne pytanie. Proszę bardzo.
Precision and completeness. I have simple, formal, fundamental questions. It could be treated as childish. What is science? There are hundreds definitions of science. What is proper definition science and what is not science?
Well, I would say that science is trying to understand
to
the world
Professor
in
Malgorzata.
terms of natural laws. I mean,
What
you
is
know,
science and pseudoscience?
well, pseudoscience pretends to be science, but it
Have
doesn't do.
multitude of definitions.
But it doesn't do what science does. It doesn't make predictions. It doesn't bring things.
It's not clear to
consilience,
me.
All of these sorts of things.
And first
it
of all,
doesn't have proper
tests.
experimental method. I mean, that's why people are not spiritualists, because it doesn't work.
Science make predictions, tests, and if the test confirms that it is accepted in science. If not, it's disposed and we look for something else. Thank you.
Professor
Darwin
Behe.
scientific.
I think
From
somebody,
this point of view.
I think somebody once said that science is looking out into the world and doing your damnedest to find out what's going on. Sometimes that fits your preconceptions of the way things should be, and sometimes it doesn't. So just going out and investigating what's going on in nature, what nature looks like, and so on, is science. And let me just add that throughout the history of science, there have been major changes where an underlying philosophical perspective was challenged and changed. For example, Newton's theory of gravity was suspected because it seemed to invoke unseen interactions between distant bodies, and that seemed spiritual to many people of the time. And the Big Bang theory, as I spoke about before, challenged people's philosophical assumptions that the universe should be eternal. Nonetheless, those things were consistent with the evidence, and I think intelligent design is as well.
But can I just make one comment? I think you could regard intelligent design as theological. It's not a theology I like, but I think that's perfectly legitimate. It's when intelligent design claims to be science, then it's pseudoscience, because it does not generate testable predictions and all of those sorts of things.
Well, I disagree, and let me just say that the same was said of the Big Bang. People said that that was pseudoscience because science, by definition, required the universe to be eternal and unchanging, and that Big Bang challenged that.
Dobry wieczór, Andrzej Olszewski. Mam pytania do pani profesor. Powiedziała pani w czasie swojej prelekcji, że Homo sapiens nie jest niczym wyjątkowym w kontekście wszechświata. W związku z czym mam prośbę, czy mogła pani jakąś ewidencję na tą tezę przedstawić, jakieś dowody, przykłady? Czy znamy jakieś inne cywilizacje, które by podobnie funkcjonowały do naszej? To pierwsza rzecz. Druga rzecz, powiedziała pani również, że był wielki wybuch. Współczesna fizyka na podstawie teorii względności jest w stanie określić to, co nastąpiło 10 po minus tam 48, 10 do minus 48 sekundy bodajże. Co było wcześniej, nie wiemy. Teorie są dzisiaj bardzo różne, więc to no, prosiłbym też o wyjaśnienie, skąd pewność, że był wielki wybuch, bo wiemy, że coś się wydarzyło, natomiast nie wiemy, czy czas na przykład nie był ujemny, czy nie był to koniec innego wszechświata. Dzisiaj jak gdyby no, Meissner na przykład ma taką teorię. I trzecie pytanie. Odrzuca pani w swoim warsztacie naukowym logikę, fizykę, matematykę, mówiąc, że nie mają zastosowania do biologii. Przynajmniej tak to zrozumiałem.
Nie, absolutnie nie.
To dobrze, bo moje pytanie też kolejne dotyczy tego, czy w swoim warsztacie koncentruje się pani na nauce rozumianej arystotelowsko, że jest to poszukiwanie prawdy, którą logicznie jesteśmy w stanie dowieść, czy raczej w progrewistyczny sposób pani uznaje za prawdę to, co chce uznać, że jest prawdą? Dziękuję.
Absolutnie nie. Staram się patrzeć na różne strony i dlatego jestem tutaj, słuchając moich kolegów. Druga rzecz, nie odrzucam wprost, przeciwnie. Prawa, uważam, że z tego, co wiemy, jestem o tym przekonana, prawa fizyki, chemii, biologii i również inne prawa, których jeszcze nie znamy, one rządzą światem i biologicznymi jednostkami, którymi my jesteśmy. Druga rzecz. Pytał pan o extraterrestrial. Nie wiemy nic o żadnych innych extraterrestrial beings i organizmów. Szukamy, sprawdzamy i tak dalej. Jak na razie nikt nic nie znalazł. Trzecia rzecz, Big Bang. Oczywiście nie wiemy i nauka nie ma w tej chwili odpowiedzi, co było przed Big Bang. Jest określenie, że z infinitive singularity the matter and energy started to expand. Skąd wiemy, że świat rozszerza się? Dlatego, że jest to przede wszystkim redshift when we look at the spectroscopy. So this is confirmed. So świat rozszerza się. Oczywiście, co było przed Big Bang, nie wiemy.
I think one of the things about science is that it's always up for grabs. I mean, this is what Sir Karl Popper said. Science is falsifiable. Anything that you hold as a scientist could, in the future, be shown wrong. And if it can't be shown wrong, then it's not science. And that's why I think intelligent design theory is not science, because I don't think there's any empirical evidence which would make intelligent design theorists deny that intelligent design is operative in this world.
May I just mention that I would disagree. I think intelligent design is easily falsified. For example, if Richard Lenski went in his laboratory and grew his bacteria for a long time and something very complex, a new mechanical system, for example, turned out to be produced, and my claims about the requirement for design to put together a purposeful arrangement of parts would be blown out of the water. On the other hand, I think Darwinism is very hard to falsify. For example, Lenski and many other folks think that the bacterial flagellum was produced by random mutation and natural selection. So suppose they go in the laboratory and they grow a bacterium for a long time, and they look later and, oh, well, gee, nothing much happened. Or they go in, as they did, and dozens of genes were destroyed. Would they admit then that Darwinism was falsified? No, they'd say, well, we should have waited longer. We should have grown the bacteria under different conditions. We should have used another strain of bacteria. They would always have some fallback position. So I disagree with Professor Ruse. I think the strong point of intelligent design is that it's falsifiable, and lots of people have been trying to falsify it for decades now. On the other hand, I think Darwinism is as pretty close to unfalsifiable as you can get.
Dzień dobry, Dawid Weremczuk. Też pytanie do pani Małgorzaty. Pani profesor, krótko. Wielokrotnie odpowiadała pani na pytanie, że czeka pani na badania, które pojawią się w przyszłości, które potrafią lepiej wyjaśnić ewolucję. Takie stwierdzenie pojawiało się wielokrotnie lub może źle zrozumiałem. I kiedy profesor Behe na przykład przedstawia swoją koncepcję jako taką, jak ja to widzę, odpowiedź, to teraz pytanie, jakie kryterium stosuje pani, czy zastosuje pani w przyszłości do przyjęcia danej koncepcji naukowej, a jakie kryterium stosuje pani do odrzucenia danego wyjaśnienia stosowanego chociażby przez profesora Behego? Dziękuję.
Already going over time. I think you should
To, o czym mówiłam, jest, że znajdujemy w odniesieniu, że może w przyszłości będziemy lepiej wiedzieli, rozumieli czy znali inne prawa, to chodzi o znalezienie może innych dodatkowych mechanizmów. Bo cała dyskusja o teorii Darwina składa się w sumie z tego, jakie były mechanizmy. I te mechanizmy, które proponował Darwin, zostały potwierdzone, wiele jest nowych. I teraz tak, jakie ja stosuję kryteria w swoich badaniach? Ja oczywiście badam mikroskamieniałości, w związku z tym nie mogę ich przetestować, klonując czy stosując jakieś inne metody. Natomiast patrząc, jaka była ich sekwencja i jaka jest niektórych z tych organizmów powinowactwo do współcześnie żyjących organizmów, z tego mogę wnioskować, że takie mechanizmy, jakie były zaproponowane, funkcjonowały. Selekcja, mutacje, przede wszystkim to, o czym nie mówiliśmy, bardzo ważny mechanizm to jest lateral gene transfer. I to jest w procesie endosymbiosis and phagocytosis. And in fact, it is accepted now by the genetics that this mechanism was responsible for the origin of eukaryotic cell by endosymbiotic first nucleus, then mitochondrion, and then plastids. So this was confirmed by the genetics. So again, the present day biological achievements would confirm what was before predicted or infer on different bases. Thank you.
Proszę Państwa, mamy godzינę 25. No, proszę.
Professor Karpiński, molecular biologist. I have a question to the Professor Moczydłowska-Vidal about genes. The oldest evidence of any gene sequence is several million years old. On which basis are you assuming that the dinosaurs or any other fossil organisms were encoded by genes like we have now?
Well,
on which scientific basis?
The best example is human species. We know for human species, let me explain. Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthaliensis, Homo denisovan, Homo floresiensis. And we have very elegant evidence based on genetics.
It's a 200,000 years. I'm asking about 1 billion years or
but
500
let
million
me
years.
finish what we know. And based on genetics, and genome of the Homo neanderthaliensis was inferred, and this was Svante Pääbo from Sweden, who is working in Germany, and relatedness to Homo sapiens, we have 3% of the Neanderthal
Excuse me, I asked about the dinosaurs. On which basis are you assuming that the dinosaurs were encoded by the genes like we have now?
Because they were reptiles, and in many reptiles were related to dinosaurs, they have genetic or sequences or nucleotides which are known in present-day reptiles.
This is now. What the evidence from the 500 million years ago or 400 million years ago?
If we have no genetic material, we can't say.
Exactly.
Dziękuję
So
bardzo.
what is your point?
Dziękujemy bardzo, drodzy Państwo. Jest z nami pan Romulo Carlear. Bardzo pana proszę, momencik, bardzo pana proszę o zadanie pytania. Jest pan gościem specjalnym. Szanowni Państwo, niestety nasz czas mija nieubłaganie, ale pamiętajcie, że mamy jeszcze rozmowy kuluarowe, więc zapraszam Państwa także do tych rozmów za momencik. Niestety mamy po 21. Pan Romulo zadaje pytanie i tym kończymy tę część. Bardzo proszę.
First of all, Professor Ruse, Professor Vidal, I'd like to thank you, both of you, because not many would come here and discuss with ID folk, and you are clear.
Thank you.
And you're clearly on a minority position in a lot of people, so I appreciate that. Thank you very
I'm a
much.
philosopher. I expect
Yeah.
people to disagree with me. If you agree on everything, you're not listening to me.
Sure. Anyway, Professor Ruse, I would just like a question. Darwin, in a letter to William Graham, he mentions, I'm not going to quote the whole thing because I don't remember, but at one point he's agreeing with his friend, but he says pretty much that I cannot trust my own reasoning because I evolved from a monkey, right? And now, more recently, Thomas...
You've been reading Alvin Plantinga.
Yeah, Plantinga, and more recently, Thomas Nagel wrote a book about that. So my question to you is, if we evolve by blind causes that care not about truth values, why should we believe in your argument, and why should evolution have produced a brain that is capable of knowing things, right and wrong,
Well,
truth and
I
falsehood?
mean, this is, as I say, sounds to me like you've been reading Alvin Plantinga. And first of all, I think, obviously, in general things, we believe what's going to work. I mean, in other words, I think you and I talking together are not really battling with crocodiles in the Florida Everglades. So I'm quite happy with that. But if you say, yes, but we might be all deceived, you know, we think the world's red because we don't know any better, then I say yes. I think we have a correspondence theory of truth. Those who, coherence theory of truth. Those who go for a correspondence theory, like Immanuel Kant, run into all sorts of problems about the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. And all his critics afterwards said, Kant invokes the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, it doesn't do any work, and we don't know where it is, we can never look at it. So why bother? So I personally am quite happy to be a correspondence theorist and leave it at that. But don't forget, I'm not saying it's all, you know, you can believe what you like. No, of course I'm not saying that. What I am saying is, ultimate reality, I'm not too keen on that idea.
But if we do not have that trust in the intellect, why should I trust the theory of evolution to
Well,
begin
don't
with?
forget Darwin immediately says, Plantinga doesn't quote the next sentence in the letter that he's writing, and he says, but of course I don't know about these things, so why should you take me seriously? So Darwin, you know, wasn't that confident when he said that. But I'm quite comfortable with what he said, because I think we certainly have criteria in order, which enable us to, as it were, sort out the real from the obviously bogus. I mean, to go back to Plantinga's sort of argument. You and I are here in Cracow discussing philosophical questions. We are not in the jungle fighting crocodiles. Because fighting crocodiles, philosophy isn't really the best of all possible things. So I think within the context, we can make all sorts of distinctions and falsifiability. But then you say, yes, but couldn't we be mistaken about... Yes, I say yes. I'm a coherence theorist. But I say to you, you're a correspondence theorist. Tell me, why should I believe in the Ding an sich? Why should I believe in, you know, reality in itself? And I want to say that the Ding an sich just doesn't work. Now, if you're a Christian or a believer, you might say, well, yes, I believe that. But the thing is, now, Darwin is making a scientific statement. I think you're making a metaphysical statement or a religious statement. As Martin Heidegger says, What is the main question in metaphysics? Why is there something rather than nothing? And I don't think science even is in that game. So there you are. I think if you want to believe in absolute reality, like you're a Calvinist, you believe in what is it, divinitatis, whatever it is, fine, but that's a religious statement. It's not a philosophical statement. It's not a scientific statement.
Thank you. God bless you.
Dziękujemy bardzo. Brawo. Szanowni Państwo, i tak już jesteśmy po czasie. Powiem tylko tyle, to już wszystko na dzisiaj, ale oczywiście zdaję sobie z tego sprawę, że temat absolutnie nie został wyczerpany. Wręcz przeciwnie, mamy nadzieję, że to wydarzenie zaowocuje i zainspiruje uczonych do podjęcia dalszej dyskusji na temat teorii inteligentnego projektu w naukach przyrodniczych, a naszych słuchaczy zachęcamy do śledzenia dalszych wiadomości na ten temat na stronie w poszukiwaniu projektu wp-projektu.pl i na profilu Facebook Fundacji Arche przeczytają Państwo o najnowszych inicjatywach, takich jak choćby konkursy stypendialne i tłumaczeniowe oraz o kolejnych spotkaniach. Polecamy też podcast N jak nauka, gdzie wybitni eksperci dzielą się swoją wiedzą. Zapraszamy również do stoiska z książkami, jeszcze wydawnictwa Fundacji Arche. Przy opuszczaniu sali, drodzy Państwo, bardzo prosimy o zdanie odbiorników w obsłudze w wyznaczonym miejscu przy drzwiach. Bardzo ważna informacja, autokary do Niepołomic wyjeżdżają o 21:30 spod hotelu. Na koniec raz jeszcze dziękuję w imieniu organizatora Fundacji Arche, szanownym prelegentom, drodzy Państwo. Wielkie brawa raz jeszcze dla Państwa. Dziękujemy serdecznie za debatę, ale także uwaga, drodzy Państwo. Także Wam jako gościom serdecznie dziękuję za przybycie i udział w dzisiejszym wydarzeniu. Mam nadzieję, do zobaczenia na kolejnym takim. Spokojnego wieczoru, spokojnej nocy. Do widzenia.